The Middle Ages is one of the most formative periods in European history. In many ways, we can call it formative because this is the time period, really, that Europe became Europe. Indeed, a lot of changes have occurred in the modern world, and the modern Europe today looks nothing like the Middle Ages. But it is during this time period that we can really speak of a European continent with distinct kingdoms that looks nothing like it did before. The Middle Ages often invokes images of castles and knights and princesses and jousting contests and chivalry and troubadours. All those things are true. But I think as we study the Middle Ages, we'll find that it's a very rich period with a lot of significant developments politically, economically, socially, technologically, religiously, and also in regards to its art. I like to date the Middle Ages as the years between 476 and 1400 AD. I choose these dates, although there's many others that could be chosen, because I think it fits nicely in between the fall of Rome, which occurred in 476 AD, and a good starting point for the Renaissance in 1400 AD, which was clearly a reaction and a rejection of the Middle Ages. Of course, a lot of historians would take issue with the term itself, the Middle Ages. Certainly, contemporaries did not identify themselves as living in an age in the middle of something. They certainly didn't know what the future held, so they couldn't see themselves in the middle of anything. Others have found that the Middle Ages is a much more diverse period and should be divided into smaller categories. But nevertheless, I think I'll stick with the traditional designation of the Middle Ages and date this period from 476 to 1400 AD. In this lecture, we will look at all the varieties of periods of life and time periods and some of the ebb and flow of the history from this 1,000-year period. Again, to understand the Middle Ages, we might think of this timeline of Western civilization. I've divided this historical time period in three very traditional categories of the classical period, the medieval or Middle Ages, and the modern period. By the classical period, of course, we mean Greece and Rome, which dates well back into the BC years and then ends somewhere around 476 AD with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Of course, the Eastern Roman Empire did not collapse in that year, not until 1453. The medieval period, which we date from 476 to 1400 AD, fits nicely in between the classical period and the modern period. And most historians identify the beginning of the modern period in 1400 with the significant changes brought about by the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, which of course leads to the Reformation, and the Reformation instrumental in leading to the Age of Discovery and also the Scientific Revolution and the subsequent Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution and the political revolutions that would take place in the next several hundred years. Again, we should understand and remember that people living in the medieval period did not designate themselves as medieval people and didn't think of themselves as living in the middle of anything. If anything, they saw themselves as living at the end of history, that with the collapse of Rome, it was just a matter of time before Christ's return, and we saw the end of the world with the elevation of the righteous to heaven and the judgment of the wicked being sent to hell. The medieval period is often seen as a derogatory term used by Renaissance historians and modern historians as denigrating this time period in between two more significant time periods. That's where we get our word Middle Ages or medieval from Renaissance thinkers and Renaissance historians. They held clear contempt for this 1,000-year period between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of their own time period of the Renaissance. Modern historians have tempered that opinion to a degree by pointing out some of the significant political, economic, religious, social, and even technological contributions of people living in the Middle Ages. In order to understand the Middle Ages, we should have a clear memory of what occurred before, and that, of course, is the Roman Empire, We divide Roman history between the Roman Republic and the subsequent Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, of course, was ruled by Roman emperors in its latter years. And you can see from this map, in 117 AD, this was the extent of landholdings of the Roman Empire. It extended all the way to the border of Scotland in the north. It controlled portions of North Africa, most of what we designate as Western Europe today, but also into the east, deep into the east, including what we call Turkey today, and the Middle East up into the Caucasus Mountains, and then down into Egypt as well. It is the largest empire the world had ever seen. And many contemporaries, of course, thought that it would never end, that it would never collapse. But of course, as the centuries go along, the Roman Empire becomes too large to manage, too expensive, too difficult, too diverse, too spread out. And enormous factions develop across the empire that threatens the control of the emperors. And so it is in 285 AD that the empire is divided into two kingdoms led by two emperors. To the west, Maximilian was the emperor of the west, and to the east, Diocletian, whose idea it was to divide the empire, ruled in the east. This is often called the diarchy. By 285 AD, it is clear that the Roman Empire is becoming so cumbersome to rule that it required two rulers. Moreover, it is shortly after this that the empire is actually divided into four sections, with two leaders claiming the title of Augustus and two other leaders claiming the title of Caesar, dividing up the large landholdings of the empire after 299 and making the empire more easily managed. So what we can see as we go into the 3rd and the 4th century, that the empire was just too large to govern, and slowly it is fragmenting into really what are smaller kingdoms. And so in the end, what we can identify is a large empire to the west, the Western Roman Empire, with its capital traditionally at Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital created by Emperor Constantine at Constantinople, today called Istanbul. These two kingdoms will be the two remnants of the once mighty Roman Empire that existed at the time of the birth of Christ. The Western Roman Empire eventually would cease to exist in 476 AD, but the Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, would last with its capital at Constantinople all the way until the year 1453. The Western Roman Empire, which concerns us now, was really overwhelmed by a number of factors. There are numerous causes for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. These include political causes, economic causes, social causes, religious causes. We can see rival factions and numerous civil wars developing between empires, emperors, and their respective dynasties. There are significant economic problems in the fall of Roman Empire, including debasement of the currency, high inflation, large property taxes, or inadequate taxes to pay for the cost of the empire and its legions. There were social divisions. There were religious divisions, particularly Christianity, which undermined the divine claims of the emperor and turned the religious affections of its citizens towards the person of Jesus Christ. There are many causes that led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But the most significant, and we could say final hammer blow that led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was the invasions the empire suffered by numerous barbarian tribes that emerged from the east and then gradually moved west. Some of these invasions were the simply migration of peoples looking for more land, looking for more food, and overwhelming their neighbors. But the net effect was gradually the Western Roman Empire begins to deteriorate. It gets eaten away at its edges, including far-off Britannia and also Germania, and then gradually the empire itself is just pulled apart by numerous barbarian tribes, including the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, The Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons, the Franks, numerous tribes that invaded all over the Roman Empire, eventually leading to its collapse. If we want to identify the final significant event that led to the collapse of Rome, we might see it in the surrender of the 12-year-old boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, surrendering to the Gothic king, barbarian king Odoacer, in 476 AD. That is the traditional date that historians often use to identify the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD. Now, modern historians often wonder if we should call it the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because for a lot of contemporaries, they really didn't notice much difference between 475 and 477. For many of them, they were already living in some type of barbarian kingdom with rival factions opposing other local groups. And so it's not like the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was major news or felt very significant in 476. Others like to point out the continuity between what came before and what came after. Some have called 476 AD the year that the Roman world transformed. That could possibly be helpful because by 476 AD, Western Europe certainly looks nothing like the mighty Roman Empire that existed before, and already by 476 AD, the former mighty Western Roman Empire is divided into numerous barbarian kingdoms. Many rival groups contending for land and water resources, migration, and dominance over the vast stretches of the European continent. It is in this context that we enter, perhaps, what we could call the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and begin to talk about the formation of Europe and the European countries. Before we begin examining individual countries on the European continent in the medieval context, we should note that the early medieval period is a very dangerous place in many ways for the residents of these barbarian kingdoms, whether they be former Latins who had lived under the Roman occupation before, or if they were indeed legitimate kindred of the barbarian kingdoms that had moved into these areas. Gradually, barbarians marry Latins, and we have the development of modern European ethnic groups. But it's a very dangerous place where they live because there is a military threat from the north and there is a military threat from the south that threatens the existence of these small fledgling kingdoms in the early medieval period. The threat from the south extends from the so-called Saracens. We might think of the Saracens as Arab warriors who emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula after the conversion of the Arabian Peninsula to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and Islam. These Arab warriors, often at the time called Saracens, invaded their neighbors out of the Arabian Peninsula, took over the Middle East, and gradually moved across Egypt and North Africa and threatened the southern borders of Europe itself. Indeed, by the 600s, Islam had spread all across what was previously the Persian Empire, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, North Africa, and had taken over the majority of the Iberian Peninsula, what we call Spain and Portugal today, even threatening the Frankish kingdom, or what we call France today. So there's a strong Islamic tradition and heritage in these areas of North Africa and even into Spain itself. And many contemporaries in the early medieval period were wondering how far was the Islamic threat going to go? How far would the Muslim warriors be able to invade? Would they be able to take over all of southern Europe or perhaps all of the continent itself? So there's a grave military threat extending from the south, made worse with the advent of the so-called Seljuk Turks, which had emerged in Anatolia. Anatolia is what we call Turkey today, or at the time Asia Minor. And these Turks inherited the Saracen kingdom of the Arab warriors. And of course, they had an affinity in religion because they were both Muslim peoples. And after taking over the Saracen territories, they continued to move and threaten against the south of Europe and also the southeastern portions of the European kingdoms. Eventually, the Seljuk Turks settle down and create their empire, extending out of what we call Turkey today and become known as the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire is going to be a very significant, long-lasting empire that will extend all the way until the end of World War I. Eventually, their greatest triumph will be the conquering of Constantinople and the defeat and the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453, but their kingdom will last all the way into the 20th century. So the Muslim threat from the south was significant for early European kingdoms, and an even greater military threat, it came from the north. It is the Vikings of Scandinavia that continually would harass and pillage, murder, rape, invade, and steal much of European prosperity, particularly in the northern kingdoms. In many ways, the Vikings were the most feared threat for Europeans living in the early medieval period. These Vikings emerged around countries what we would identify today as Norway and Sweden and Denmark, setting up coastal settlements along the ocean. Indeed, they're very significant seafaring people. They developed primitive lodging in the Scandinavian areas. They, according to early medieval perspective, were pagan worshippers worshiping Norse gods, including Odin, the chief of the gods, and also his son Thor, who is the god of thunder, and also Loki, the god of mischief. This is one significant archaeological piece here that archaeologists have found as an example of Mjolnir, the mythical hammer of Thor, which was found in Sweden. The Vikings didn't spend a lot of time at home, it would seem, because they would frequently go on raiding parties and exploration journeys to the northern parts of Europe and also western parts of the Atlantic Ocean. It would be the Vikings that would first settle the island that would eventually become known as Iceland, and then proceed further and colonize the coast of what would become Greenland, and then also have some contact with the North American continent. There is evidence that they created some settlements and did some fishing and exploration and settlement in areas of what we would call Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, perhaps Maine, perhaps further inland into the northern part of what will eventually become the United States. And so the Vikings develop a very famous reputation for being explorers and colonizers in areas of the North Atlantic that Europeans had never deemed to go that far. They're famous for their famous Viking ships that could strike fear in the hearts of any of the residents of towns that they would be raiding. And indeed, one of the most feared sites would be for Vikings to descend in the fall after the harvest period and to descend on northern European states, and after subduing the local forces and knights, be able to seize the harvest for the entire year, and then also kidnap individuals of these northern European states and use them for slaves. Famously, in 845 AD, the Vikings actually managed to send their ships and raiding parties all the way down to the city of Paris, moving along the Seine River, and surround and lay siege to the city of Paris itself. And so the early years of the Middle Ages indeed are a very dark, difficult, dangerous, foreboding period. That is why this time period often gains the moniker of the so-called Dark Ages. Now, a lot of early historians would use that term, the Dark Ages, to designate the entire medieval period. That designation of the Dark Ages, of course, also played in well with Renaissance thinkers who held the medieval period in low regard as a period of very little art, very little technology, poor standard of living, and an abundance of superstition. Subsequent historians would only use the term the Dark Ages to refer to the initial centuries of the medieval period instead of the entire 1,000 years. So some historians would refer to simply from the years from the fall of Rome until the 10th century, the Dark Ages. Now, what they meant by using that term was that not necessarily that the sky was dark or the situation was dark and despair and people are full of ignorance, but rather historians are full of ignorance because so many sources and manuscripts and archaeology was destroyed with all the warfare between barbarians and Vikings and Muslims and European tribes that we know very little about this time period. So it's not the people themselves of this time period, but rather historians today who are in the dark because we just don't know a whole lot about these centuries. And then other historians as well would say that the Dark Ages is not a useful term at all. And we should pay closer attention to the sources we do have regarding this time period. So despite the fall of Rome and despite the threat from the north with the Vikings and the threat from the south with Muslim invaders, small European kingdoms gradually start to emerge in the decades and centuries after the fall of Rome that we might designate as barbarian kingdoms. By barbarian kingdoms, we mean the fusion of these barbarian tribes that had invaded from the east and had moved west and gradually had subdued and taken over land masses of the previous Western Roman Empire and had intermarried with the Romans or Latins of those areas. And gradually, as the centuries pass, you have the development of new ethnic groups that slowly and incidentally will become the ethnic groups of modern European states. And so we can see that once the European continent is really conquered by these barbarian tribes, and gradually they stave off the threat of Muslims from the south and Vikings from the north, they are able to settle down and create these kingdoms. I say kingdoms because barbarian tribes were often led by a barbarian chieftain or some type of tribal leader, but gradually as warfare ceases or is at least reduced, gradually that chieftain and his family would emerge as some type of dynasty of rulers. However, in the 500s and 600s and 700s, Western Europe still is a dangerous place. And of immediate concern for Europeans, particularly the peasant class that would spend the entirety of the spring and the summer planting and tending to crops, not wanting to lose those crops to Viking and Muslim raiders, it was of prime importance that European kingdoms protect their lands from foreign invaders. It is for that reason that we see the emergence of the primary political system of the medieval period known as feudalism. Feudalism was a way to marshal armies and numbers of knights and forces together in order to counteract military threats to a kingdom. The standard model for feudalism would be that the king, who theoretically owned all the land of the kingdom, would give a piece of the land to a noble, often called a fief. That piece of land, the fief, was given to a noble. In exchange for the land, the noble would provide knights to add to the king's army to protect the entirety of the kingdom. That's a very basic, simple definition of feudalism, but I think it gives the idea of the importance it places on security and the exchange between kings and their servants. And so gradually, over time, this system develops in order to improve the armies of the king and to prevent military invasion and pillaging of foreign forces. Once that fief was given to a nobleman, often the nobleman, therefore, would also break up that fief or that parcel of land, give land to one of their knights, and the knight would promise to send some of his forces, some of his men, any troops under his command to report to the noble, and the noble would then in turn send them to the king. And so gradually what we can see is the development of armies in Europe to defend themselves against the Vikings or Muslim attackers, and also the centrality of the king in the system. The ceremony for the distribution of the fief to a lower official was known as investiture. Often the ceremony would involve the subject receiving the land, known as a vassal, to place his hands between the hands of the king, known as the lord. So the lord-vassal relationship, with exchanging a fief and other feudal dues and duties in response for protection, is the primary organizing system of the Middle Ages. This chart is helpful for us to understand the social classes of the Middle Ages. Again, the king is at the top, who ostensibly owns all the land, and because he needs forces to protect the kingdom, he would provide a fief to a lower vassal. Those vassals would promise military aid, loyalty, taxes, terms of service to their lord, the king. And then those vassals would in turn become lord to a smaller vassal beneath them, perhaps a knight. And those knights would provide military service or homage, some type of taxes, duties, food to the nobleman, and the nobleman, as their lord, would provide food, protection, or shelter. And then the pyramid extends further, with those vassals becoming lords to other vassals, often the peasants, who would pay their rents and farm the land in exchange for food, protection, or shelter. So the lord-vassal relationship continues to extend down the feudal pyramid, dividing up society, but also centralizing in a new way the power of the king that early barbarian chieftains could only dream of. The feudal relationship is the primary political system of the Middle Ages, and it results in kingdoms, such as this one, the Kingdom of the Franks, being divided into smaller plots of land, but yet nevertheless holding on to its identity as a one unified kingdom under one king that nevertheless is able to protect itself. So one of the long-term impacts of feudalism is the growing power of kings, the centrality of monarchy, and also the establishment of these European kingdoms. Whereas feudalism is the primary political system of the Middle Ages, manorialism is the primary economic system of the Middle Ages. By manorialism, we mean the life on manors that most lords, knights, and peasants lived on. This is where most Europeans live. We can think of a European or medieval manor as a self-sufficient farm or plantation. This is where Europeans would spend their entire lives. They would be born on the manor, they would grow up on the manor, they would receive whatever rudimentary education they would on the manor. They would work their entire life on the manor. They would marry somebody on the manor, bear their children on the manor, grow old on the manor, die on the manor, and then also be buried on the manor. And indeed, it was a self-sufficient system. On the manor itself, in terms of the Middle Ages, it had everything a peasant was supposed to need. There was the lead manor house where the lord or the knight would live. And then there were peasant huts where the peasants, or the serfs, would live on the land. There were local forests and berry patches for the picking of fruit. There were, of course, the fields where the peasants or serfs would spend the majority of their days, 6 days a week, working in the fields. And then also a local river, perhaps a mill, and of course the all-important church, where all serfs were required to attend each Sunday morning. The largest structure on a manor was the lord's house itself, the manor house, often made of stone in the interest of protection. These manor houses were certainly a better system of living for the lord or the knight that owned the manor or supervised the manor. It was certainly better than a hut, but these manor houses were often cold in the winter and very hot in the summer as well, loaded with dirt and disease and bacteria and not very comfortable living conditions, but nevertheless a stone structure which was very important in times of invasion. Most serfs lived in huts, thatch huts, on the manor. In these huts, you did not have any concept of a nuclear family, but rather upwards of 30 or 40 or even 50 people lived inside of a large thatch hut. In the middle of the winter, often animals, including cows and sheep and pigs and chickens, were brought into the hut. There was a dirt floor, and of course these huts were often loaded with snakes and mice and fleas and ticks, as well as plenty of bacteria and disease. It was a very low standard of living in the course of the Middle Ages, but it is on the manor that the average peasant spent the majority of his days. Historians who have conducted studies of the medieval manor have estimated that the average serf living on a medieval manor probably met or knew roughly 50 to 60 people in their entire lifetime. The average serf, perhaps once in their lifetime, traveled 5 miles to a neighboring manor. The concept of travel or finding a different source of employment or marrying someone outside of your kindred group was simply unknown during the time period. You lived, you died, and you spent the entirety of your existence on the manor, living and working in very arduous conditions across the Middle Ages. During the medieval period, on these manors, they practiced what is known as the three-field system, in which they would designate 3 fields of the manor, 2 of them used for planting and harvesting on a given year, and the third being left fallow in order for the nutrients, particularly nitrogen, to be rejuvenated into the soil. Perhaps on one of the fields they would grow wheat or rye, the other ones being oat and beans. And of course that reveals the very limited diet that most people in the Middle Ages lived on. They lived on an extensive amount of bread and perhaps some fruit and berries, perhaps some wine or beer. Very little water was actually consumed due to its lack of purity, and meat was extremely rare in these conditions. A few people do not live on the manors, but rather live in a local town. In a local town, you may have shopkeepers and various journeymen, apprentices, and masters who are plying their trade. Perhaps there were butchers and bakers, candlestick makers, barrel makers, blacksmiths, perhaps, and some opportunities and some products that were available in medieval towns that were not available on the local manor. In a lot of these shops, there would be a master of the shop who owned the shop who would be training an apprentice. Once that apprentice had completed his apprenticeship, he would be allowed to become a journeyman to travel around to ply his trade before he became the master of his own shop. A lot of these early master, apprentice, and journeyman networks within a trade formed what were called guilds, associations of common laborers in a given field. These medieval towns gradually grow in size and population as we go through the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, some of them becoming rather large and increasingly fortified to again protect themselves against the military threats from the north or the south. This example is from Carcassonne, France, which you can identify the large double-walled moat around the town on top of this elevated plain here, provided for maximum protection. Gradually, slowly, as we move through the Middle Ages, increasingly Europeans, as the military threat declines, begin to trade with each other, know each other, and form extensive trade networks, often using waterways, whether it be the sea or rivers, to connect with other towns and other manors. These trade networks are small, but gradually areas of Europe in the north realize they can produce crops and products that the south cannot, and the south can produce products that the North cannot. And so it becomes the interest of all these kingdoms to form gradual trade networks across the continent, working together for the increased standard of living for everyone. It is impossible to understand medieval Europe without a thorough understanding of the centrality and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. The medieval period goes part and parcel with medieval Catholicism. Christianity, which had emerged as a small sect in and around Jerusalem after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the teachings of his apostles, quickly spread across Palestine into neighboring Syria, gradually into Egypt, and then also across Asia Minor and into Greece and Rome. The early church fathers were instrumental in clarifying Christian doctrine. As they did so, Christianity was viewed as a great threat by the Western Roman emperors. Indeed, they viewed Christians as a threat to their own claims of divinity, claiming that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and had died for the sins of his followers. And so, as a result, the Roman Empire began the intense persecution of Christians. That persecution, bloody and extensive as it was, eventually ceased in 313 when Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan identified Christianity as a legal religion in the Roman Empire. It ceased persecution of the growing and very popular sect by the 4th century. It was the Emperor Theodosius II who declared Christianity not only worthy to be persecuted, but actually the official religion of the Western Roman Empire. As a result, previous Roman pagan priests who had overseen the temple of Jupiter or Mercury or Diana gradually moved away from their pagan gods and transformed much of previous Roman religion and merged it with the new popularity of Christianity. It is in the late Roman Empire and then into the early medieval period that we see the emergence, the growth, and eventually the dominance of Christianity in Western Europe. That version of Christianity that emerged in Western Europe, it is clear by the early medieval period, will be in accordance with the Roman Catholic model, in which it elevated the Roman bishop, the Bishop of Rome, as the prime bishop over the church and a significant authority in determining issues of faith and doctrine. By the Middle and late Middle Ages, Christianity, Roman Catholic Christianity, had asserted its dominance so much over Western Europe that a prime doctrine of the church in Latin was extra ecclesiam nulla salus, which means outside the church there is no salvation. It was inconceivable for the medieval Roman Catholic Church for individuals to find salvation and go to heaven apart from the institutions, traditions, and requirements of the Roman Catholic Church. Christianity, which gradually spread across the southern portions of Europe, gradually makes its way into the barbarian kingdoms of the north through the missionary efforts of famous saints of the early medieval period. This would include St. Patrick, who in the 5th century became a missionary and converted much of the island of Ireland to Christianity. He dispatched St. Columba, who moved over to Scotland and converted much of Scotland to Christianity. This is followed in the 6th century when Pope Gregory dispatched Augustine of Canterbury to move into England and oversee the conversion of many of the Saxons to Christianity and subservience to the Roman bishop. St. Remigius oversaw a very important event in the history of Western Christianity when, in 496 AD, he baptized the king of the Franks, Clovis I. This was a very significant event because with the baptism of the king, it was soon to follow that the entire kingdom of the Franks would convert to Christianity. St. Boniface is the significant missionary who was dispatched by the church to go into Germania, one of the more feared areas of barbarian dominance, and convert many of the barbarian tribes there to Christianity. St. Boniface is known as the Apostle of Germany for his efforts there. So gradually, by 600 AD, large sections of Western Europe are Christianized, and gradually the barbarian tribes are giving up their pagan loyalties and their pagan gods. The Christianity, however, that develops in the Western Roman Empire is significantly different on many points with the Christianity that took hold in the eastern parts of the former Roman Empire. This, as a result, leads to one of the major splits in the history of Christianity between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. The split took place in 1054, although it was a long time coming. As a result of the split, we have the dominance of Roman Catholic Christianity, headquartered in the city of Rome and overseen by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, in the West, and then we have the Eastern Orthodox Church, which predominated in the Eastern Roman Empire, which was headquartered in Constantine's city of Constantinople, overseen not by a pope, but rather the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Some of the significant differences between Western and Eastern Christianity, the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, had to do with their primary city, which they recognized as the headquarters of their faith. A lot of it also had to do with the authority of their main leader, whereas the Pope in Western Christianity extended a lot of authority and claimed his authority over other bishops. The Patriarch was viewed in the Eastern Orthodox Church as equal among other bishops. Also, what was significant in the Western Roman Catholic Church is that Latin was spoken in the liturgy, whereas Greek in the East. And the Western Roman Catholic Church, particularly the Pope, claimed authority over kings and emperors, whereas in the East, the emperor asserted his authority over the patriarch and the bishops of the Orthodox Church. In the Western Roman Catholic Church, priests were not permitted to marry. They were in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And in the Western Roman Catholic Church, divorce was not permitted, where it was allowed under certain conditions in the Eastern Orthodox Church. For the Western Roman Catholic Church, papal primacy was one of the key doctrines of the Middle Ages. Papal primacy asserts that the Bishop of Rome is of greater significance than other bishops in the Roman Catholic Church. That the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, holds greater authority, greater influence, and is allowed to make greater determinations regarding doctrine and tradition in the authority of the Church. Commensurate with papal primacy is the so-called Petrine doctrine. The Petrine doctrine, fundamental to the development of the papacy or the Pope, is the belief that Jesus made the Apostle Peter the first leader of the church, the first pope. That when Jesus said, "Thou art called Peter, on this rock I will build my church, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven," Roman Catholic authorities really believe what was occurring there is that Jesus was making the Apostle Peter the vicar of Christ, his representative on earth, his earthly representative, and the prime authority in the church. This painting by Sandro Botticelli during the Renaissance indicates this event. Of course, Orthodox Christians do not hold to such an interpretation, and neither do Protestants. Protestants assert that when Jesus said to Peter, "On this rock I'll build my church," Protestants believe what Jesus was referring to was Peter's remarks that "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," that Christ is the rock upon which the church is built, not Peter and not his so-called authority as Pope. Gradually, throughout the medieval period, but not completely clarified until the 19th century, is the doctrine of papal infallibility. Papal infallibility asserts that the Pope, when he speaks ex cathedra, when he speaks, as it were, from the sacred chair, when he speaks as the leader of Christianity, that he is without error, that he cannot make errors when it regards faith and doctrine. This is going to become very significant in the latter Middle Ages as the popes continue to assert their authority, and then, of course, Reformation theologians will directly challenge this assertion by the popes, claiming that it is the Bible and not the pope that is the sole authority for matters of faith and doctrine. Gregory I was certainly one of the most significant early popes of the early medieval period. Gregory I introduced significant reforms to the church and introduced several concepts that would become predominant throughout the medieval period and even into modern Roman Catholicism today. It is from Pope Gregory I that we get the famous Gregorian chants, the concept that priests, bishops, archbishops, frequently during Mass, will chant the Mass and the words of the liturgy. It is also from Pope Gregory that we have clear understanding on what is the Roman Catholic position regarding the Mass, particularly transubstantiation. It was also from Pope Gregory that the so-called Gregorian mission, the mission of Augustine of Canterbury, was dispatched in order to oversee the conversion of the Saxons to Christianity, which enjoyed great success. Today, Pope Gregory is buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the lead church of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, Italy, today. Another significant pope of the medieval and early medieval period was Pope Leo III. As we'll see a bit later in this lecture, Pope Leo III was the first to establish the precedent of crowning a European head of state. He crowned Charlemagne as the king of the Romans, which we could really date the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. This event really shows the significance of popes, their centrality, and their authority even over kings and emperors. This struggle between kings and emperors, of course, is going to become a struggle throughout the Middle Ages, with popes asserting their authority, religious and political, as greater than that of European kings, and of course European kings often arguing that they held greater authority than the Pope. One event that really highlighted the conflict between European kings and popes was the so-called Investiture controversy of 1075 to 1077. The right of investiture refers to the power to appoint church officials. It refers to the power to appoint an archbishop or a bishop to a lead position in the church. Of course, during the medieval period, kings, heads of European states, endeavored to claim that authority for themselves. They, of course, wanted to appoint bishops and archbishops that would be loyal to them and serve in the interests of the king and not put the church before monarchical interests. The Pope, as the leader of the Western Roman Church, believed it was his responsibility to appoint bishops and archbishops that would be first loyal to the church and the Pope, and then second to the local monarchy. This controversy came to a head in 1075 when Henry IV, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, decided that he wanted to continue to appoint bishops and archbishops in the empire apart from the Pope's authority. The Pope, of course, at the time was Pope Gregory VII, who contended the right of the emperor to do this, and the controversy came to such a head that Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV in the middle of the investiture controversy, claiming it was the sole right of the Pope to appoint officials to the church. This event really shows just how powerful popes were during the Middle Ages, because gradually, as officials in his own empire abandoned support of the emperor for his position, eventually Henry IV finds himself standing outside of the papal residence in the snow for several days, begging for the Pope to meet with him, begging for forgiveness, and asking to have his excommunication revoked and to be reinstated in the church. The scene of an emperor or a monarch bowing before the Pope, standing in the snow, waiting to be granted a papal audience, spoke a lot about the authority of the popes during the Middle Ages. And indeed, they are the most powerful figures in Europe, even greater than kings, for much of the Middle Ages. Popes are elected by the so-called College of Cardinals. The College of Cardinals will meet in modern era in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican when the previous pope has died, and they will vote and elect on one of the cardinals to become the next pope. Once that vote is taken and a new pope is chosen, the pope will often take on a new name for his pontificate, and he becomes, in terms of Roman Catholic doctrine, the vicar of Christ, the prime authority of the Roman Catholic Church. So the Pope is the head of the medieval Catholic Church. Beneath him are the cardinals that serve the Pope directly. And beneath the cardinals are archbishops. An archbishop could be the prime Catholic figure in a European city. Beneath the archbishops could be a bishop, which would be more of a regional or a local official who would report to the local archbishop. And then beneath the bishop, of course, would be the local parish priest. The local parish priest would perform a lot of the religious ceremonies required by the church and that were deemed to be necessary for Europeans to experience salvation. That would include marriages and baptisms and also funeral rites in order to provide the resources of the church. He would, of course, also oversee the daily mass at the church, of course, which all residents were required to attend. Besides these official positions in the medieval Catholic Church, monasticism is a very important religious tradition over the course of the Middle Ages. Middle Ages and medieval Christianity is not the first place to identify monks and nuns, those that have cordoned themselves off from society, removed themselves from traditional earthly pleasures in order to be devoted to a faith. But certainly medieval monasticism is very important for the identity of the Middle Ages. There were many monastic groups across the Middle Ages. Many of these groups were formed to reform the church, and gradually when they became lax or were viewed as corrupt, perhaps even heretical, then a new monastic group was formed to replace them and to reform the existing church. This would include the Benedictines, formed by Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict was important for crafting the Benedictine rule. Benedictine rule required strict standards of behavior in which monks would obey the abbot, who would be in charge of their monastery. They would also take vows of poverty and not engage in earthly riches, and they would also take vows of chastity, agreeing not to get married and not to enjoy sexual pleasure during their time on earth. The Benedictines were gradually important, but became corrupt over the centuries, and so an important reform movement was formed by Bernard of Clairvaux called the Cluniacs. Other important monastic groups include the Cistercians and also the Augustinians, formed by Augustine of Hippo, and then also the Franciscans, formed by St. Francis, who renounced his worldly life in order to live a monastic life, inspiring his brothers and followers to do the same. And then St. Dominic was also the founder of the Dominicans, which was also a very important monastic group in the Middle Ages. 7 key teachings known as sacraments are very important for the medieval Catholic Church. The first of these is baptism. Medieval Catholics believe that baptism, performed shortly after birth, was the beginning of the process of salvation. That parents were required to bring their child to the local parish, and then the priest would baptize that child for a fee, guaranteeing them entrance into the church. It would initiate their journey as a Roman Catholic and a loyal son or daughter of the church. When that child grew older, usually in their early teen years, they would undergo confirmation, in which they would become full members of the church and also be allowed to participate in the Mass. The Eucharist, often called the Lord's Supper, by Protestants, or the Mass by Roman Catholics, is the prime ceremony of Roman Catholic Christianity, and particularly the medieval period. Indeed, Roman Catholics still today do not reference going to church, but rather going to Mass as the central ceremony of their faith. The Mass is a very important and required event for European Catholics, and failure to attend and participate could risk their salvation. Other important sacraments include penance, in which an individual who had committed sins and confessed of those sins before their priest would often be told to go do good deeds or to pray prayers in order to atone for their sins. Perhaps the penitent one, the repentant one, after confessing their sins to a priest, would be told to say multiple Our Fathers or multiple Hail Mary prayers, or perhaps go perform good deeds, give money to the church, light candles, pay for masses to be said, or buy an indulgence ticket to atone for their sins. Anointing of the sick is also a very important rite in which the priest could come to a sick person's house, anoint them with oil, and pray for their healing. Also, a part of the anointing of the sick is what is known as extreme unction. Extreme unction is also known as the last rites, in which a priest would pray over a person about to die or a person who had died, guaranteeing them entrance into the afterlife and preventing them from going to hell. Matrimony is recognized as one of the 7 sacraments in the Roman Catholic Church, and so are holy orders, which is, of course, joining a monastery or a convent as a monk or a nun. Roman Catholics recognize 7 sacraments. They recognize these sacraments as important deeds to be done to receive grace. The only way that sins can be atoned is if these deeds are done regularly and correctly, can an individual's sins be forgiven. The Mass is, of course, central to these 7 sacraments, and the doctrine of transubstantiation is central to the Mass. The doctrine of transubstantiation asserts that when the priest elevates the bread and the wine, often known as the bread as the host, that at that moment, when the priest says in Latin, "This is my body broken for you," that at that moment, the bread is no longer bread. It is transubstantiated, changed in substance into the literal flesh of Christ that was crucified. And when the priest elevates the cup with the wine and says, "This is the cup of the new covenant shed for you," that at that moment, it is no longer wine in the cup, but rather it is changed in substance, transubstantiated into the literal blood of Jesus Christ. Worshippers thereafter are invited to participate in the Mass by eating the host, eating the bread, and later on drinking the cup. And from that ceremony would gradually receive grace. Actually, in the early years of the Middle Ages, worshippers were denied the bread, but only allowed a taste of the cup. Transubstantiation is going to become the magical or mystical ceremony endemic to the Middle Ages, that if worshippers were deemed to be not in the good graces of the church and not permitted to approach the table and participate in the Mass, that indeed they were jeopardizing their own salvation. Indeed, one of the greatest punishments a medieval Christian could receive is to be denied the Mass and to be excommunicated from the church. If that person died at that moment in a state of excommunication, they would go straight to hell. Other opportunities to atone for sins and remain in the good graces of the church could be not just to pray to God or the Virgin Mary, but rather to pray to saints. The saints were particularly holy, particularly good or noble or devout Christians who had gone before and died, had given their entire lives to the church. And subsequently, by the leadership of the church, meaning the Pope, they had been beatified, which means that they had been canonized to become a saint. Once a person became a saint, other Christian worshipers could pray to them to receive special grace or special favors. This doctrine is known as the intercession of the saints, the fact that the saints advocate on behalf of earthly Christians still living on earth. All of the sacraments and doctrines of the church were designed to get someone to be a devout worshiper to the Roman Catholic medieval church. And hopefully, if their deeds were so good and if they had accumulated enough righteousness by their good works, that they would go straight to heaven. Those who are outside of the church, heretics, excommunicates, Muslims, pagans, and even often Orthodox Christians, were sent straight to hell. But according to the teachings of the medieval church, most, even devout, medieval Roman Catholic Christians would not go straight to heaven because they were not good enough. And even if they did all the requirements of the church, did not go straight to hell, but would rather go to a zone in between heaven and hell known as purgatory. Purgatory in Roman Catholic teaching is a place of suffering. And no one could tell an individual how long they would be in purgatory, but they could offer opportunities to reduce their suffering, reduce their time in purgatory, or reduce the time of a relative in purgatory and get them out of the state of suffering where their sins are being purged. Therefore, living worshipers could buy indulgence tickets, or they could have masses performed, or candles lit, or other good deeds performed at a cost in the church. And then, as a result, it could reduce their time in purgatory, or it could reduce the time of their relatives from this place of great suffering. Fundamental to the doctrine of purgatory is an understanding of how good works are achieved and a state of righteousness are achieved. According to medieval teaching, only saints were allowed to go straight to heaven because they were so righteous and so devout and such good Christians. The good news for living Christians is that those same saints had leftover righteousness that is deposited in, figuratively, a treasure chest in heaven known as the treasury of merit. This is the leftover surplus righteousness of the beatified saints. The good news for contemporary medieval worshipers, according to the church, was that they could access this righteousness, excess righteousness of the saints, if they were willing to purchase indulgences from the church. An indulgence would mean that they would be indulged, freedom from their sins, and granted righteousness that wasn't theirs, but rather was from the saints. They could tap into the treasury of merit by paying for an indulgence, again through a mass or lighting of candles or additional church ceremonies, or simply by purchasing an indulgence ticket. As a result, these indulgence purchasers would receive righteousness from the treasury of merit, reduce their time in purgatory, and expedite their journey to eternal happiness. This doctrine of purgatory and of the intercession of the saints and of the treasury of merit, transubstantiation, the Mass, and indulgence sales all will, of course, become key flashpoints, key areas of disagreement that will lead to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Also, of course, fundamental to medieval Catholicism was the worship of Mary. During the medieval period, there was a growing understanding or assertion, belief, that the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, was of equal importance to the worship of God and of Jesus and of the Holy Spirit as well. Frequently, the Virgin Mary appears with the Christ child, or the Virgin Mary appears by herself. Gradually, the doctrine of Mary is developed to include key tenets that Mary herself was born from a virgin as well. Her traditional mother of Saint Anne conceived and bore her as a virgin, and that Mary herself was without sin, and that Mary herself did not die but was rather assumed up to heaven, and now worshippers were able to pray to Mary herself, and Mary would advocate on behalf of the devout Roman Catholic on behalf of them, and advocate to God or to Jesus to hear their prayer. So there's a growing doctrine and emphasis on the worship of the Virgin Mother as we move through the Middle Ages. Also important during medieval Roman Catholicism was the veneration of relics. Relics are items from church or biblical history assumed to have religious and spiritual significance. These items may extend back to the Old Testament. There are various areas in medieval Europe that claim to have had a stick from the burning bush that Moses witnessed, or they claimed to have some of the sandals from the 12 apostles, or they claim to have straw from the manger in which Jesus was placed upon his birth, or they even claim to have milk from the breast of the Virgin Mary. They claim to have a splinter from the cross or a thorn from the crown of thorns. All these items from biblical or church history connected frequently to saints gradually become the destination of pilgrims that they would seek to go venerate, pay their respects, or perhaps worship these items, and then as a result receive an indulgence and reduce their time in purgatory. There are churches that claim to have the skull of the head of John the Baptist. The Basilica of St. Domenico has the actual head of Catherine of Siena, a saint who is beatified. The church also claimed to have the blood of St. Januarius, the tongue of St. Anthony, the bones of the apostle St. Peter himself, the famous veil of Veronica, and then the entire bodies of revered saints or popes may be revered, and the destination of pilgrims, such as that of Pope John the 23rd. All these relics and the pilgrims that they attracted, of course, became an enormous revenue source for the church during the medieval period and throughout the subsequent history of Roman Catholicism. The liturgy and the services of the medieval church are all performed in Latin. Latin is viewed as the holy language of Roman Catholic Christianity, and so all rites and ceremonies and services were performed with a Latin liturgy. This is, of course, a problem for most Europeans, because most Europeans are unable to read, and most Europeans do not understand Latin. Only a small educated class actually held on to the old language of the Roman Empire. Actually, most Europeans usually speak a vernacular, a local language, and don't understand Latin. So as a result, there's a growing disconnect between medieval worshipers and the church that they are required to attend, because they don't understand what is being said and what is being taught. The entire Bible, which was written in original languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, is translated into Latin in the early medieval period, largely through the efforts of St. Jerome. That Bible becomes known as the Vulgate and is the only official recognized Bible of the medieval Catholic Church. In fact, in many areas of Europe, it is illegal, even under threat of imprisonment or death, to be caught reciting or translating the Bible into the vernacular, the local language that people understand. Rather, there are very few Bibles in the medieval period. They tend to be very large. They are all hand copied in Latin. Quite often they are chained to the altar of the local church, if the local parish church has one. And so as a result, knowledge of the Bible, reading of the Bible, and understanding of the teachings of the Bible are almost non-existent in the medieval period, because it is constructed in Latin and there are so few copies of it. There's growing concern about the health of the Roman Catholic Church as we move through the medieval period. And a lot of these doctrines face increased criticism, concern, and questioning as we move into the High Middle Ages. One of those, of course, is the practice of simony. Simony is the purchase of a church office from a secular or religious authority. This practice of an individual who happens to have the money gets to be named a bishop, an archbishop, or a cardinal, or even a pope, of course, leads to corruption of the church. And many devout medieval Christians begin to question the sincerity and the purity of the church by the fact that individuals are able to buy an office and not earn the office because of their exceptionally holy efforts. The primary philosophical school of thought during the Middle Ages is known as Scholasticism. Scholasticism is a growing body of educational and philosophical thought that emerged in European universities during the medieval period that endeavored to reconcile faith and knowledge. Europeans were fascinated by the challenge of trying to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian doctrine. And they really believed that there were possibilities of uniting the teachings and philosophical concepts of the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle with traditional thought. They believed they are one in the same. As a result, scholasticism often resulted in asking very minute questions. It could lead to very redundant questions, trivial questions, and there's a lot of philosophical, theological wrangling that occurred in the lecture halls of medieval universities. And in the end, scholastic thought is more of a baptized form of Greek paganism than it is more in lines with pure Christian doctrine. The prime scholastic thinker and writer of the medieval period is the most famous doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, who is St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was a priest and also a thinker, and his prime theological and philosophical work is the Summa Theologica, published first in 1485, and then subsequently published in English many years later. This is an effort to reconcile the faith teachings of the medieval Catholic Church with traditional pagan philosophy and theoretical and philosophical questions as well. And St. Thomas Aquinas becomes the guiding thinker for Roman Catholic theology for the centuries to come. So in the medieval period, we can see that there's really three different stations in life, or three different classes of people in the Middle Ages. And medieval contemporaries were aware of these. There's, of course, the clergy, which eventually in France will become known as the First Estate. There is the Second Estate, known as the knights or the noblemen, traditional aristocrats. And then there's third, the peasantry, or everyone else. The medieval world is a very stratified, rigid world defined by class distinctions. They spoke of an order to the universe, that everyone had their station in life, and individuals should not aspire to something different or to aspire to a higher station in life, but rather whatever order of being they're born into in the great chain of being, that they should be content in that position, that life on this world is very short and temporary and hard and evil, and all of your efforts should be directed towards reaching the afterlife and not a focus on contemporary things of this world. There's no question that the Roman Catholic Church is the predominant religious institution in the Middle Ages and for centuries to come. But there are those, of course, Europeans that oppose the authority of the church, question the church, challenge its doctrines, and even reject its authorities in sections of Europe. These groups we can identify as heretical groups, as those that challenge the authority of the Roman Catholic Church during the medieval period. One of the early prominent groups we could identify as heretical would be the Albigensians, sometimes known as Cathars. The Albigensians really reflect some of the more pagan philosophies that emerged out of the Greek world. They held to a strict dualism and some Gnostic ideas that were not consistent with Roman Catholic Christianity, and often their books were burned and their adherents were persecuted across Europe. Another significant group that challenged the authority of the Catholic Church were the Waldensians. founder of the Waldensians was a regional preacher in the southeast of France, particularly in the French Alps, known as Peter Waldo. We know very little about Peter Waldo, but it is his last name that gives rise to his group of followers known as the Waldensians. Peter Waldo and the Waldensians, in many ways, are very early forerunners of reform thinkers that would emerge during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The Waldensians rejected the authority of the Pope, rejected key doctrines such as transubstantiation and the importance of works as being efficacious to achieve one's salvation, challenged the authority of the Pope, and certainly rejected papal infallibility and also the purchase of indulgences. Whereas they did not have a fully developed theology as that will emerge during the Reformation, the ideas that will give rise to the Protestant Reformation certainly are there in the teachings of Peter Waldo and in his followers in the Waldensians. The Waldensians are also the target of some vigorous persecution by local Roman Catholic authorities. In this illustration here, Waldensians are portrayed as witches in 1451. Another significant critic of the church emerged at Oxford University in England in the 14th century. This is John Wycliffe, who was a parish priest and a teacher at Oxford and also a writer. He becomes a very early critic of some of the key doctrines of the church centered around transubstantiation and Mariolatry and the purchase of indulgences and the doctrine of purgatory and papal infallibility. And Wycliffe introduces a key idea that will become fundamental to the Protestant Reformation about 200 years later, and that is the authority of the Bible itself. To that end, Wycliffe rejects the authority of the Pope regarding faith and doctrine and says rather that faith and doctrine must always spring from the sole absolute authority of the Word of God itself. Wycliffe undergoes the arduous task of endeavoring to translate large sections of the Bible into English. That, of course, was a grave crime in the 14th century to translate the Bible out of the holy language of Latin into the local vernacular of English. Nevertheless, Wycliffe and his followers managed to translate substantial sections of the Vulgate, working directly from the Latin into the English. And gradually, the teachings of the Bible emerge in the English tongue. Wycliffe dies of a stroke in 1384 in his pulpit, but his followers continue the work of Wycliffe, including preaching in the vernacular, sharing passages of the Bible in English, and also rejecting the authority of the Pope. Their enemies begin to designate the followers of Wycliffe as the Lollards. This was an insult against them, as if they were children prattling about and la 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 la, just pronouncing new doctrines that were inconsistent and heretical to the church. Nevertheless, Lollardy becomes an important movement early in the history of the church. It's very critical of the Roman Catholic Church, and we can see the beginnings of the Reformation in England with the movement known as Lollardy. John Wycliffe becomes such a controversial figure later on that Catholic authorities, well after his death, will dig up his body, burn it, and then scatter the ashes in the local river. Perhaps the key heretic or threat against the Roman Catholic Church in the high medieval period would be that of John Huss. John Huss becomes the leader of a substantial rebellious movement against the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church in Central Europe. And his teachings would reverberate into the following century, well into the Protestant Reformation. John Huss was from a small Czech town, and he was Czech himself, known as Husinek, which means goose town. Indeed, his last name means goose. John Huss was trained to be a priest and learned his Latin and gradually becomes more familiar with the teachings of the Bible. And then very controversially, from his city of Prague, where his parish church, the Bethlehem Chapel, was located, John Huss begins to preach in the vernacular. He begins to preach in his native Czech language. He begins to translate portions of the Bible into Czech and read those portions of the Bible, not in the Latin, but in Czech. And as a result, begins to criticize the authority of the church, the authority of the Pope, and says that he sees no reason for the authority and station of the Pope in the teachings of Scripture, or the role of Mary, or the need for indulgences, or the doctrine of purgatory, or the teachings of the Mass, or denying both communion elements to worshipers. Needless to say, John Huss' teaching attracts a lot of attention, even as he's attracting a lot of followers. Eventually, local church authorities impose an interdict on Prague. An interdict essentially is a church strike in which all the services and provisions of the church, including required ceremonies, are shut down. That is, of course, of great significance in the medieval period because Roman Catholic Christians were not guaranteed salvation unless they participated in things like baptism and the last rites and the Mass. And so as a result, John Huss is a very controversial figure. Although he is promised safe passage to advocate for his ideas at the Council of Constance in 1414, eventually Huss is arrested and placed in prison when the church officials begin to meet in the German city of Constance in 1414. Huss was also under the impression that he'd be able to explain his ideas and prove from Holy Scripture that what he was teaching was from the Bible and not of his own mind. And indeed, he offered, if he could be proven wrong from Scripture or from plain reason, that he would be willing to renounce his so-called heresies and burn his own books. Nevertheless, Huss is not given a full trial. He is offered to recant his teachings and not defend them. And after several sessions of interrogation, finally Huss refuses. He is declared to be an arch heretic, and then he is burned at the stake in 1415 at the conclusion of the Council of Constance. The burning of John Huss sent a clarion message to the medieval world that the Pope was still holding on to his authority, that there would be only one Roman church, and that heretics would be prosecuted, those that challenged the authority of the Pope. This, of course, is where we get our famous saying, "Your goose is cooked," as John Huss's last name meant goose. Nevertheless, when Huss is burned in 1415, it does not lead to the end of his movement. The Hussite movement extends well into Bohemia, the area that we would call the Czech Republic today, and begins to spread across Central Europe. They are hounded and hunted as heretics, but nevertheless, the reforming ideas that John Huss advocated become very prominent and do not go away, continue to challenge the church, and of course, eventually also inform the prime teachings of the Protestant reformers. Indeed, the Protestant reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin will look back as the teachings of John Huss and see there the seed of their ideas that they were teaching in the 16th century were there 100 years ago, calling for the sole authority of the Bible in matters of faith and doctrine and rejecting the authority of the papacy in regards to the Western Church. One of the most important events in the history of the Middle Ages were the Crusades. The Crusades were a military effort by European Roman Catholic Christians to liberate the Holy Land of Palestine and the city of Jerusalem from the Muslim occupiers that controlled that land. For many years after the visions of Muhammad and the expansion of Islam, Muslims had taken control of Palestine and the city of Jerusalem. This, of course, was a huge embarrassment to European Christians, that the birthplace of Christianity was being held by these Seljuk Turk invaders. Therefore, to that end, many calls went up in the Middle Ages for European armies to endure the long, arduous journey all the way to the Holy Land in an effort to liberate Jerusalem and the surrounding areas from the Muslim occupiers. The significance of this event would take place for years to come, as they would fundamentally change the relationship of European Christians to Muslims. It would impact the development of Europe, and it would change the nature in which European states related to each other. over the course of 300 years, there would be multiple efforts to liberate the Holy Land. The first significant call for Europeans to launch crusades into the Holy Land occurred at the Council of Clermont in 1095. In that year, Pope Urban II declared, "Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. God has conferred upon you, above all nations, great glory in arms. Accordingly, undertake this journey for the remission of your sins with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven." There are many motivations that crusaders had in an effort to go all the way to Palestine. One of them was to impress ladies, others were to please the king, but another significant was in order to receive remission for their sins. This was the promise that the Pope offered very early, from the very beginning with the First Crusade. It was in the following year that the First Crusade to Palestine from Europe was launched. This crusade would take place over the course of 3 years from 1096 to 1099 and saw armies from all over Western Europe travel all the way across Europe in an effort to get to Palestine. They endured numerous conflicts with Seljuk Turk forces along the way, particularly in Asia Minor, and as they entered into the area of Palestine, they enjoyed some early successes. They lay siege to the city of Jerusalem itself. Eventually, they sacked the city, killing many of the defenders, and liberated the city from its Muslim invaders in 1099. Thereafter, the Crusaders of the First Crusade established several important Christian kingdoms in Palestine in which they hoped to maintain control of the area. But nevertheless, the First Crusade was considered a great success, as indeed they had liberated the city from its Muslim occupiers. This would, however, be the only time the Muslims would give up the city of Jerusalem to the Christians. In the future, in subsequent crusading events, the results would be far more mixed, and never again would the Christian crusaders enjoy the success that they achieved under the First Crusade. The Second Crusade was started in response to the fall of the county of Edessa, which was overcome by the Turks. Edessa had been one of the first Crusader states to be founded, but it was also the first to be lost to the Muslim Turks. Therefore, another call went out for a Second Crusade, which was launched in 1147 and lasted until 1150. The Second Crusade was called for by Pope Eugene III, and it was the first crusade to be led by European kings, including those of France and the Holy Roman Empire. 2 European armies suffered defeats at the hands of the Turks even before they arrived in Palestine, and then the remnant of their armies launched an ill-advised siege against the city of Damascus. The siege failed, and the Europeans were defeated and forced to retreat home. The failure of the Second Crusade was a prime reason for the subsequent fall of Jerusalem back into Muslim hands and the launching of the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade is probably the best known and perhaps the most significant of all the Crusades. It was the Third Crusade that featured some of the more memorable characters and events in the entire campaign to liberate Palestine from Muslim control. By the end of the 12th century, the Muslim forces that were in control of Jerusalem and Palestine were under the command of the highly effective and revered leader Saladin. Saladin was a Muslim Kurd who had become sultan of both Egypt and Syria. His lands extended across the Middle East, into Arabia, and throughout North Africa. In Saladin, Christian crusaders would encounter a very shrewd and effective enemy who was determined to block crusader advances into Palestine. The Third Crusade was also known as the King's Crusade, as 3 notable European monarchs led their armies all the way to Palestine in an attempt to liberate the Holy Land. Philip II of France was one of the most powerful monarchs during the entire medieval period. Indeed, during his reign, he transformed France into the most powerful of all European kingdoms. He personally led a sizable army of French troops to the Holy Land. Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, also participated in the campaign, marshaling a large German army for the liberation of Palestine. Richard I might have been the most charismatic member of the Third Crusade. He set a new standard for strength and authority among English kings and tirelessly used the resources of his kingdom to conduct military campaigns in France and then the Holy Land. Upon the drowning of Frederick and the departure of Philip, King Richard was left in command of the European forces in Palestine and left to negotiate the treaty to end the crusade with his rival Saladin. The Third Crusade got off to a bad start, particularly for Emperor Frederick, who, although he led a large army across Eastern Europe and scored several key victories against Turkish forces, the emperor drowned while trying to ford a river in Asia Minor. The German forces were left demoralized, and many turned for home. The combined forces of the English and French arrived in Palestine and managed to wrest control of large sections of land away from the Muslims and gradually moved towards Jerusalem itself. The Third Crusade was partially successful, as it did liberate large sections of Palestine from the forces of Saladin, but it failed in its primary goal to reconquer the city of Jerusalem. As in the conflict in Palestine dragged on, Saladin and King Richard were increasingly eager for an end to the conflict. Both faced internal threats in their homelands, and they were eager to restore control over their own home kingdoms. The Muslim leader Saladin and King Richard I of England negotiated the Treaty of Jaffa to bring an end to the Third Crusade. By the terms of the treaty, Christian merchant and pilgrims who were unarmed were promised safe passage across Palestine to Jerusalem, even though the Holy City itself remained under Muslim control. Muslim holdings were reduced in Palestine, and the Christians gained increased lands in the area, but Jerusalem itself remained under Saladin's control. The Fourth Crusade indicates a shift in the efforts of the Europeans to retake the Holy Land and the city of Jerusalem. It is clear by the time of the Fourth Crusade that animosities between Europeans and rivalries within the Eastern Empire began to trump the original mission of liberating Palestine. Whereas the Crusaders set out from the west to once again endeavor to liberate Jerusalem, through a series of events, many of the Crusaders never even reached Palestine and became sidetracked with a military endeavor against the Eastern Roman Empire. The primary irony of the Fourth Crusade is that the Crusaders who set out to wage war against the Muslims ended up in conflict. The conflict was between the Roman Catholic Christians of the West and the Eastern Byzantine Orthodox Christians of the East. The Western Crusaders agreed to an unexpected deal with the Doge of Venice, who was promised them sea passage if the Crusaders would help Venice sack the city of Zara on the Adriatic Sea, in the interest of the city of Venice. The Crusaders agreed to do so, and the sack of Zara became the first time Catholic Crusaders sacked another Catholic city. Furthermore, by becoming entangled in the rivalries that were at that time engulfing the Eastern Empire, the Crusaders also attacked and captured the capital of the East, Constantinople. The most infamous action of the Fourth Crusade was not the sack of some Muslim city in Palestine, but rather the sack of the Orthodox Christian city of Constantinople. The Crusaders took advantage of dynastic rivalries, a popular uprising, and instability in the East to overcome and pillage the city. Many of the Crusaders, after sacking Constantinople, never even continued on to the Holy Land and turned for home. Needless to say, the sacking of the capital of the East only further embittered relations between the East and West and made any reconciliation between the Catholic and Orthodox Christians impossible after their split in 1054. Besides the failure to liberate Jerusalem, one of the most significant consequences of the Fourth Crusade was that embittered relationship between the East and West, as well as the accelerated decline of the Eastern Empire. The Crusaders saw to it themselves that the Eastern Empire was divided into smaller states after the pillaging of their capital. The Fourth Crusade would so significantly impair the Eastern Empire that its decline would continue all the way to its fall in 1453 at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, when once again Constantinople would be captured by invaders. The peak of European interest in the Crusades passed after the Fourth Crusade and gradually declined in the remaining decades of the 13th century. Yet an additional 5 crusades took place in the remaining years of the century. The Fifth Crusade witnessed a change in strategy to liberate the Holy Land. A polyglot European army landed in Egypt instead of Palestine, endeavoring to crush the regional sultanate and thereby gain control of Jerusalem. After some initial successes, however, the Crusaders were soundly defeated in Egypt and forced to retreat and withdraw, accomplishing none of their goals. The Sixth Crusade was particularly unique as the campaign revolved more around diplomacy and negotiation than actual military conflict. After much negotiation, Europeans gained some concessions regarding Jerusalem from the Muslims, but little that was substantial was actually achieved. The Seventh Crusade was centered primarily on King Louis IX of France's efforts to liberate Jerusalem. He too endeavored to move against Palestine by first attacking Egypt, but Louis IX also met with failure in Egypt, even suffering the embarrassment of being captured by Muslim forces. Few in Europe came to assist the king after his release, and the Seventh Crusade, as well, ended in defeat and embarrassment. The Eighth Crusade was an additional humiliation for Louis IX, as he only managed to land an army on the coast of Tunisia, where he subsequently died, leaving his army demoralized and forcing them to retreat. The Ninth Crusade is often considered the last crusade by Europeans to liberate the Holy Land. It was led by Edward, Duke of Gascony, the future Edward I, King of England. Edward engaged in some significant clashes with Muslim forces, but due to concerns and threats back in England, he too was forced to withdraw. It was clear by the Ninth Crusade that Europeans had lost interest in the goal of conquering Palestine, and after nearly 300 years of attempting to do so, they abandoned the crusading spirit and turned their attention to concerns closer to home. Perhaps ironically, Europe in the Middle Ages faced its greatest crises at the end of this time period. That seems ironic because at the beginning of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, with the invasions of the barbarians and the threat of war and plague and political instability and the breakdown of economic trade routes, seemed like a particularly galling time for Europeans. And it seemed that across the centuries that Europe was emerging from the darkness and enjoying a period of prosperity and growth and stability. Much of that growth and prosperity, however, must have felt lost in the 14th century and its several crises. Indeed, the century of the 1300s is known as a great century of crises, with 5 significant events that only damaged the power of monarchies and the Catholic Church, but also disrupted some of the stability and economic prosperity that Europeans had started to enjoy. There are 5 major events that we can identify as part of the crises of the 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the Babylonian captivity and Great Schism that the Roman Catholic Church experienced during the century. The Great Famine of 1315 brought an end to that growth and prosperity that Europe was experiencing in the previous 2 centuries. The Great Famine started with bad weather in the spring of 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316, even until the summer harvest in 1317. And Europe did not fully recover until 1322. Crop failures were not the only problem. Cattle disease caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80%. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide. It was an ominous beginning to this dark and trying century, known for its death and destruction. The English Peasants' Revolt was a widespread uprising by discontented peasants throughout England in 1381. There were a multitude of causes to this revolt, including plague conditions, unstable leadership, and the high taxes imposed, along with feudal dues imposed on the English peasantry. The peasants initially achieved some success in their revolt, including entering into London, murdering a multitude of royal officials, and even forcing King Richard II of England to retreat to the Tower of London and then meet with them, granting them their demands, including the abolition of serfdom. Once the king was free from the threat of the peasants, however, he reneged on all his concessions, and gradually the peasants were beaten back by the development of royal militias and suppressing armies. Over 1,500 peasants and their leaders were executed for insurrection. The English peasant revolt impaired the ability of subsequent English kings to effectively prosecute the 100 Years' War in France and added to the instability and chaos of the 14th century. No other event, however, in the 14th century, or even in the entire Middle Ages, was as frightening and disabling as the Black Death. The Black Death, or sometimes called the bubonic plague, was the most devastating pandemic in human history, resulting in the deaths of somewhere between 75 and 200 million people in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. It is hard to overstate just how significant and long-reaching the Black Death was on the lives of Europeans. It would fundamentally change the way that Europeans looked at the world, how they experienced life, what their expectations were for the future, their attitude towards their monarchs, and particularly their attitude towards the Roman Catholic Church. The Black Death was caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. This strain of bacteria was not new to Europeans, but it was a particularly potent strain of bacteria that was made worse by the absence of adequate hygiene and sanitation in medieval Europe. Medieval Europe, of course, was a very filthy place, with human and animal waste strewn often in street gutters, with very little attention to cleaning and regular bathing, total absence of dental care, and as a result, Europeans lived in abundance of dirt and filth and disease. In some ways, it might be surprising to wonder why there were not more plagues in medieval European history, and not why the Black Death was so devastating. There was a total absence of antisepsis and regular use of soap, and particularly antibiotics. It is tragically ironic that the Black Death in many ways could have been prevented through the simple use of soap and hygiene, and particularly antibiotics, which would have killed the bacterial strain. The bacterial strain was often transmitted through a specific oriental flea that would be transmitted on the backs of rats. These fleas would bite into a black rat and then absorb their blood. In the blood of the rat was, of course, the bacteria. And then these fleas would move from rat to rat, often on docks and in shipping ports, and in warehouses and in filthy, dirty streets. And then between the fleas and the black rats, they would gradually spread the plague. It is unclear where the plague actually originated. It could have originated as far east as Mongolia, or at least somewhere in Central Asia. What is clear, though, that it made its first manifestation in the Crimea Peninsula in the Black Sea. Gradually, probably from merchants from Venice on their ships and interacting with various dock workers and dock conditions, these fleas and rats were able to board these ships that made their way to Venice and then various ports throughout Europe. In the process, as the fleas absorbed the bacteria and then bit into the rats, gradually the rat that was carrying the bacteria and transmitting the flea as a result would bite a human. As a result of the flea biting the human, they would transmit the bacteria into the human's blood, and then often within 24 hours show signs of infection. The Black Death is known as the Black Death due to the gangrenous condition that could often be induced by the bubonic plague. It could often, in a very freakish manner, turn skin and flesh to black color and then results in death. We see very few instances of bubonic plague in the world today, but they are known in remote areas of third world countries, particularly in Africa, generally stemmed by the advent of antibiotics. Wherever the plague originated, it is clear that it probably made its first manifestation in Western Europe on the Italian peninsula and gradually spread north. In fact, it spread with great speed, starting in 1346, gradually moving across southern Europe, and then finally moving more north. What was completely difficult to understand for contemporaries about the Black Death was how the plague would completely overwhelm one city, but then bypass another. Indeed, there were areas of Europe, particularly Milan, that didn't seem to be affected at all by the plague. And it was completely confusing for Europeans to understand what was transpiring. Gradually, the plague moved all the way into northern Europe, into far reaches of Russia, and then gradually died out by the time that it had reached Scandinavia. The effect on victims of the Black Plague was particularly frightening because the effect of the bacteria would be to produce these large black welts that became known as buboes on an infected person. An infected person would experience these dark conditions in inflamed lymph nodes that disfigured their appearance in frightening ways. As a result, a person could be completely healthy and within 24 hours be overcome by all these buboes on their skin, be overcome by the plague and coughing and spitting and vomiting, and as a result, be dead within 24 hours. The plague spread with frightening rapidity all across Europe and struck terror into the hearts of Europeans, caused enormous social upheaval. Just think of the impact of walking through medieval European streets and seeing bodies abandoned on the side of the road or in the middle of the road, or stacks of corpses of infected victims on carts being pulled out of the city center to mass graves outside of the town. There was a tremendous sense of helplessness among Europeans as the plague continued to spread. They didn't understand bacteria, they didn't understand germ theory of disease, they didn't understand epidemiology, how plagues spread, and they certainly had very little understanding of how to stop the spread of the plague. It led to an abundance of theories and often quack medicine. Doctors, in an effort to treat patients, would completely clothe themselves in these protective clothings, often connecting this bird-like beak to their face coverings, in which they would insert herbs and other elements in order to prevent themselves from becoming infected with the plague. But needless to say, any medical science and medical treatments of the plagues were incredibly primitive and really did very little to stop the spread of plague and to stop the advent of death. It led to enormous cynicism and fatalism among Europeans. The Black Death infected Europeans with a mindset of death, even a worldview of death. Death seemed to be inevitable and inescapable. Whereas initially the Roman Church was viewed as the answer and the source of deliverance, the inability of the Pope to stem the plague sparked a loss of confidence in the Church and the rites it required to purge of sins. The plague seemed to be no respecter of persons between the righteous and the wicked. The Pope, at a loss for answers, isolated himself in his chambers and burned citrus woods in an effort to block the plague's advance. So even the Pope himself was seen to be retreating from the plague because of his total lack of answers. The ineffectiveness of the Church to stem the plague and its total lack of answers and cures would render serious damage to the reputation of the Roman Catholic Church and spark widespread disillusionment with the papacy. It is not a stretch to say that the Black Death, as a consequence, accelerated the coming of the Protestant Reformation as a result of the papacy's perceived weakness against the plague. Europeans, disillusioned with the Church and frustrated with its lack of answers, looked everywhere for answers. They looked to the stars. They believed that perhaps the plague was visited to them by extraterrestrials and that had emerged from an outside world, and that world needed to be made contact with or perhaps placated in order to stop the spread of plague. Others blamed Jews for the spread of the plague and conceived some type of illogical answer that because Jews were money changers and involved with trade and dock workers, that therefore they must have had some secret plot in an effort to kill European Christians by initiating the plague and allowing it to spread. Others were so disillusioned by the spread of the plague that they endeavored to punish themselves. They believed that their sins had caused the plague, and if they punished themselves as Christ had been punished for the sins of the world, then God would stem the plague. Perhaps God was angry with Europeans, and that's why he had allowed this plague to spread. Therefore, a small group known as the Flagellants would take whips and often whip themselves extensively to experience the sufferings of Christ, to purge their sins in hopes that God would stem the flow of the plague. Ironically, the Flagellants actually were probably spreading the plague more than anything, as their lacerated, bleeding backs often became open wounds, even more susceptible to infection. The Black Death resulted in the death of somewhere between 30 and 60% of the European population in the 14th century. Approximately 100 million Europeans died from the plague. It would take Europe 150 years to regain the population that it lost due to the Black Death. The Black Death was not the first appearance of the plague in Europe, and it wouldn't be the last, but it would be the most devastating and spark fears of its return in subsequent years. To make the 14th century even worse, the close of the medieval period is also marked by one of the most significant and largest and long-sustaining wars of the medieval period. This is the 100 Years' War, nicknamed because it's lasting appropriately somewhere around 100 years between 1337 and 1453. The 100 Years' War was a war between England and France. England, ever since the Norman conquest of 1066, when the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, had crossed the Channel and conquered Saxon England, the monarch of England had still retained all his French lands. The conflict of the 100 Years' War was an effort by the French dynasty to remove the English from its French lands and reestablish a strong kingdom of France, booting England back across the Channel and remaining strictly in England. Therefore, this prolonged war that stemmed over multiple dynasties and involved dozens of kings and thousands of soldiers over the course of over 100 years was a conflict in order for England to hold on to its French lands and the Kingdom of France to kick the English out. The 100 Years' War was made even more devastating by the fact of the advent of some new weapons. One of them was the bombard, which was a ballistic cannon incorporating gunpowder and the blast of a cannonball, a very primitive cannon to be used against enemy fortifications. And indeed, the English very effectively used the bombard, often in its siege against cities such as Orléans. Heavy cavalry was also introduced in the course of the war, in which well-armed cavalry soldiers and often armored horses would march into battle, providing an imposing force that could cause infantry soldiers to tuck tail and run from the battlefield. Also very important for the English in the early part of the war was the English longbow. The English longbow had been distributed widely to English archers to replace the crossbow that French troops traditionally used. The English longbow would be accurate at longer distances and had a clear effect on the progress in the early part of the war. The 100 Years' War stemmed from the fact that the English king was tired of paying feudal dues and paying his loyalty to the French king due to the fact that he held lands in France. And therefore, it had a lot to do with the relationship between the English and the French kings and the effort by the English king to free himself from the French authority, lordship, as a vassal, and hold his lands in France unilaterally. As the war developed over time, it seemed that the English were going to win the war in the early decades of the war, and indeed, the English enjoyed very significant victories, particularly at the Battle of Crecy in 1346. In that year, English forces, under the command of King Edward III, had crossed the English Channel, landed in Brittany, and then proceeded to march across the northern part of France, convincingly defeating the French troops. The largest engagement took place at Crecy in August of that year. At the Battle of Crecy, the English troops effectively used their longbows in order to rout the French troops, and foolishly, the French King Philip VI continued to send wave after wave of French troops and French artillery soldiers with their crossbows right into the teeth of the English army. As a result, the British were able to destroy one wave after another of French troops at the site of Crecy. It was a convincing victory, and it signaled that clearly the French troops under their king had not marshaled effectively against English armies. English victory continued as late in the war as 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt. At the Battle of Agincourt, the English were effectively led by Henry V, a very inspiring king who personally took part in the battle, personally fought in hand-to-hand combat against French troops at Agincourt. And at Agincourt, the English were successfully able to rout the French and take the field of battle. So, with one significant victory after the other on the battlefield, it seemed in the early decades of the war that the English were not only going to hold on to their lands in France, but perhaps expand them, perhaps wipe out the French monarchy itself. Perhaps we can see the turning point of the 100 Years' War with the emergence of the very famous Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was a common peasant girl who claimed that she had received visions from various saints to become a leader in the French army. And despite the fact of being a female with no military experience, she too would be able to help in the course of the 100 Years' War. Of course, locals thought that this was ludicrous, that a young girl would somehow be in command of royal armies, but nevertheless, she persisted in the belief that she had received these visions, and she persisted in trying to get the attention of the French king. Eventually, when she does, surprisingly, the king not only outfits her with armor, but also allows her to participate in a relief expedition to the French city of Orleans, which the English were besieging. She was permitted by the King of France to join the relief expedition to Orleans, and when she arrived, after some skilled fighting, the siege was indeed lifted. Immediately, Joan became the source of inspiration for the French troops. Joan participated in a multitude of other French victories as well, and she became the symbol of God's blessing and the blessing of the Virgin Mary on the French armies, even as the war began to turn in favor of the French. However, eventually Joan was captured in the course of one of the battles by a group of Burgundians, and the Burgundians agreed to hand over Joan to control of the English. She was arrested and kept as a prisoner in the English holding of Rouen on French soil. The tower where she was held is all that remains from the fortress where she was imprisoned. She was ruthlessly interrogated and charged with witchcraft. Her visions were decided by an English papal court as to be the result of witchcraft and the work of demons and not saints. And as a result of being convicted of witchcraft, she was charged, convicted, and eventually burned at the stake for her crimes. As a result, she eventually became a patron saint of France in the 1920s and is a revered figure in French military history and in French Catholic thought as well today. Nevertheless, by the time of Joan of Arc's burning, she nevertheless inspired the French troops, and indeed we see a turn of the tide of the war in which the French are able, with one victory after another, even after the death of Joan of Arc, to drive the English out of France, across the Channel back to their own land holdings. By the end of the 100 Years' War, it is only the area surrounding Calais in the extreme north of France that the English were able to hold on to. The 100 Years' War is a devastating war for the English, in which they lost large land holdings that they had held for hundreds of years in France. And as a result, England, in some respects, is sent into a tailspin, which is going to lead to its own dynastic war, its own civil war, known as the War of the Roses, commencing pretty much right after the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is an enormous inducement towards nationalism and French pride and French national identity as a result of winning the war. In a century that saw so much chaos and confusion and death, matters were only made worse by chaos within the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly the structure of leadership, the papacy at the top of the church, even with the authority of the Pope. Ever since the fall of Rome, and for 1,000 years, Europeans had looked to the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, to bring stability and leadership, to be the vicar of Christ on earth, to be the voice of God on earth, and provide stability and direction when there seemed to be so much death and destruction around them. Despite the chaos of the 14th century, the popes were not able to provide that leadership. And indeed, chaos within its own ranks and leadership hierarchy would lead to irreplaceable damage against the church in the 14th century. This key event damaging the papacy was known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, in which the Pope himself was made a prisoner by the French king, and then eventually led to multiple popes supposedly claiming authority over the Roman Catholic Church. The Babylonian captivity of the church, or the conflict between the Pope and the French king, began in 1309, when Pope Boniface VIII, in an effort to gain control over the French church, claimed additional authority to invest bishops. Philip IV, who was trying to assert the power of the French monarchy over the church, refused to do so. The public quarrel became intense and often nasty. As a result, the Pope excommunicated Philip IV of France. Excommunication, of course, was the highest and most damaging status that a pope could give to a fellow Catholic. But Philip IV was undeterred by this, and as a result, not only captured Pope Boniface VIII and subsequent popes, but imprisoned them in Avignon. He required that the papacy be moved from its historic location in Rome to the south of France in Avignon. Therefore, this gives rise to the title of the Babylonian captivity, referencing the time that the Jews were taken out of their land and brought to Babylon. Now the popes are taken out of Rome and brought to the French city of Avignon. It is clear by the end of the Middle Ages that the popes do not have the same authority that they enjoyed earlier in the century, and now a monarch of Europe is clearly exerting his authority over that of the Pope. This, of course, was a devastating event to the authority and the reputation of the papacy, as the popes were seen as weak and subservient to that of a monarch. Several popes, all French, resided in Avignon for the years to come. But gradually, discontent over the system led to the College of Cardinals back in Rome electing a new pope, which they claimed to be the actual pope, this being Pope Gregory XII. As a result, the Great Western Schism saw the emergence of two popes in Europe, one in Avignon and one in Rome. This, of course, to the average European Roman Catholic, was a devastating event to the reputation of the papacy, as they are struggling through famine and peasant revolt and plague and war, when they are trying to look to the authority of the papacy and hear God's voice on earth. They don't know which pope to trust and which pope to consult. Both popes claim that they are the actual and realistic pope. Both popes excommunicate each other, and it leads to further division and confusion. In an effort to resolve the crisis, the Council of Pisa convened in 1409 and elected an additional pope, Alexander V. And now, for several decades, there were actually 3 papacies in Europe. There was the Avignon papacy, there was the Roman papacy, and there was also the papacy recognized by the Council of Pisa. This only added to the confusion. It was not until the church convened again in 1414 at the German city of Constance, at the Council of Constance, that they decided to remove the other popes and elect Pope Martin V as the authoritative, actual vicar of Christ on earth, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. The other popes were removed. The papacy was reestablished in Rome along with the College of Cardinals, and it ended the Babylonian captivity of the papacy and the Great Western Schism. But nevertheless, the damage was done, because now Europeans, as they had suffered horrifically through this century, did not know who to trust, and their reverence for the church and the reputation for the purity and clarity of the church had been damaged. And it is not a stretch to say that the Babylonian captivity of the church and the Great Western Schism only accelerated calls for reform, initiated lay piety movements within Roman Catholic worshipers, and accelerated the coming of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. In order to understand the Middle Ages, it is useful to examine the art of these centuries to understand the priorities, capabilities, and perspectives of the medieval mindset. The classical period, with the accomplishments of Greece and Rome, was of course legendary for its realistic sculptures, designs, temples, palaces, and mosaics. The so-called Dark Ages seem to represent a serious step back from classical achievements as Europe struggled through migration, war, famine, and invasion, and had little time for artistic creation. Yet even in the early centuries of the medieval period, we can see the development of a distinctly European creation that we can call medieval art. To be sure, it borrows from the classical period, but it also incorporates new ideas, techniques, and spiritual priorities. Architecture may be the finest of medieval artistic creations. The medieval period witnessed the construction of some of the world's most grandest cathedrals. The fact that the largest structures in the medieval world were churches reveals the emphasis medieval Europeans placed on Christianity and the authority of the church. This emphasis on the spiritual over the secular indeed will be the predominant theme in the vast majority of medieval artistic creations, and not just architecture alone. Romanesque architecture was the prevailing form during the first half of the Middle Ages. Romanesque styles incorporated both Western Roman and Eastern Byzantine styles in its creations. Romanesque architecture is characterized by very symmetrical, blocked structures that reflect almost a fortress mentality in their construction. Romanesque architecture is known for its massive and heavy qualities, thick walls, sturdy pillars, barrel vaults, and large towers. The sheer size and weight of the structures convey power, strength, and defense against attack. Romanesque architecture is particularly noted for its semicircle arches. The distinctly Roman arches reflect the understanding that a rounded arch such as this one can hold additional weight for the massive structure that is constructed above it. Buildings of every type were constructed in the Romanesque style, with evidence remaining of simple domestic buildings, elegant townhouses, grand palaces, commercial premises, civic buildings, castles, city walls, bridges, village churches, abbey complexes, and large cathedrals. Romanesque architecture would be the prevailing structural form until the 12th century, when it slowly morphed into the distinctly medieval Gothic style. Gothic architecture, sometimes called pointed architecture, is an architectural style that was prevalent in Europe from the late 12th to the 16th century during the High and Late Middle Ages. surviving into the 17th and 18th centuries in some areas. It evolved from Romanesque architecture and was soon replaced and followed by Renaissance architecture. The defining design element of Gothic architecture is the pointed arch. A minor but significant variation on the Romanesque arch emphasizes the reaching and soaring heights of Gothic cathedrals designed to direct the viewer's attention away from the earth and towards heaven. The Gothic pointed arch was often decorated very ornately and included meticulous detail and carvings of saints, biblical scenes, or additional designs to bring more elaboration to the structure. The use of the pointed arch, in turn, led to the development of the pointed rib vault. The inclusion of ribbing in cathedral ceilings brought not only strength to hold up the large stone ceilings, but also design and a decorative element that becomes unique to Gothic architecture. The ribbed ceiling emphasized the expanse of the heavens and the loftiness of God compared to lowly worshipers. Fundamental to the size and height of Gothic cathedrals are flying buttresses, stone wall supports that enable walls to be constructed with greater support and height. Flying buttresses clearly had a utilitarian purpose, but they have become intimately associated with the fundamentals and look of Gothic architecture. Another distinctive feature of Gothic cathedrals are the famous stained glass windows, often arranged in the shape of a rose. These rose stained glass windows become one of the most beloved parts of Gothic cathedrals. While allowing in some light into the church, the windows also reflect and refract light through its colored glass panels. Gothic cathedrals usually only featured a few windows, and these did not permit much light into the cathedral. The resulting effect was a very dark cathedral that was more illuminated above than it was below. It might have been easier to see the ceiling rather than the floor. The message through this design was that worshipers were lowly, dark, and sinful, and far from God. God was high, aloof, and unreachable. The architecture of Gothic cathedrals thus reflects the theology of the Middle Ages. It is still customary to feel a sense of awe and smallness when one enters into a Gothic cathedral. Worshippers could not but help receive the message that there was a great gulf between themselves and God, and they should take advantage of any opportunity the Catholic Church provided to bridge the gulf, atone for their own sins, and try to be rescued from judgment. Medieval painting often lacked the quality and precision of later European works. Due to limited techniques and limited access to materials, medieval painters often produce very two-dimensional works that appear flat and lacking definition. Figures are heavily outlined with a dark line. Colors are dull and limited in number. A poor knowledge of anatomy resulted in figures that seem cartoonish, simple, and flat. Faces lack a diversity of expression, and a distinct realism was missing in the human form. This was not a glaring absence for medieval artists, though, because the medieval style did not emphasize human creativity, design, or place a high value on human individualism. Human figures tend to look the same because they are all viewed rather in the same light. Individualism and humanism would not become evident in paintings until the time of the Renaissance. The works of the Middle Ages paid less attention to the individual artists and the specific individuals in a composition and revealed more about the medieval mind. Life was short, man was evil, God was good, the church was all that mattered. These are the recurring messages in medieval works. Beyond painting and architecture, medieval art was also crafted in metalwork, embroidery, manuscripts, and sculptures. Despite the variety of mediums, there is a definitive unity to medieval works. The overwhelming theme is spirituality. Medieval works are almost exclusively focused on God, Jesus, the Virgin Mary, saints, Bible stories, miracles, angels, and demons. The figures may have lacked definition and technique, but the message was clear. The most important things were spiritual things, and if the medieval worshiper was to have hope, it was only to be found in the spiritual, and the Catholic Church was the dispenser of all things spiritual. Subsequent artistic movements, starting with the Renaissance, would consistently react and rebel against the limited technique and singular spiritual topics of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages has often been labeled as a period of darkness, ignorance, superstition, suffering, famine, war, and plague. It is often known for its absence of technology, abundance of bloody conflicts, superstitious medical care, oppressive Catholicism, bland art, and meager living standards. For centuries to come, Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers, scientists, and industrialists would hold the period in absolute contempt for its perceived lack of progress despite 1,000 years of European history. The Middle Ages was all those things, and these characterizations are not completely wrong. It was a very difficult time period in European history. Yet the more scientists and historians examine this period, the more they are realizing the Middle Ages was also a time of nuance and progress and development without which subsequent European history would be possible. Perhaps the most significant contribution of medieval Europe that we can point to is that this was the time that witnessed a long sought-after period of stabilization after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This period gave birth to the modern European continent that would dominate world affairs for centuries to come. The Europe we know was born in the Middle Ages, for better or for worse. Studying the Middle Ages is perhaps the best example of how examining the past helps us understand the present.